HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents From Holmes to Sherlock, the story of the men and women who created an icon, by Mattias Boström. Translated from the Swedish by Michael Gallagher. Read by Shaun Grindell. Chapter 1. It all started on a train. That's where the idea came to Stephen Moffat and Mark Gatiss. They were going to modernize one of the world's most renowned literary characters, remove the filter of a misty London full of hansom cabs, and bring Sherlock Holmes up to date, placing him squarely in our high-tech contemporary world. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's creation would go from Victorian gentleman detective to modern eccentric genius, from Holmes to Sherlock. This, of course, was sacrilege. Such a television show was bound to be controversial among the fans, as Moffat and Gatiss were aware. Nevertheless, the more they discussed it, the stronger the idea seemed to grow. They wanted to do away with the classic symbols, the deerstalker, the pipe, the magnifying glass, all the nostalgia that was getting in the way, all those things that made Holmes seem more like a well-defined silhouette than a complex human being. The changes would, however, need to be made with great love for the original stories. The pair wanted to bring viewers really close to the original friendship between Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, closer than anyone had brought them since the figures were born in the author's imagination, well over a century before. This was just a few years after the turn of the millennium, and for the time being their plan was no more than a tiny seed, just a topic of conversation during Gatiss and Moffat's commute from London to their script-writing jobs at BBC Wales in Cardiff. But there were lots of train journeys, and the idea kept on growing. A short time later, on January 7th, 2006, Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat found themselves at the Sherlock Holmes Society of London's annual dinner. Gatiss had been invited to speak, and Moffat was there as his guest. Gatiss had also attended the previous year. He had been invited by a friend, Stephen Fry, a member of the society already in his early teens, who had been guest of honour and the after-dinner speaker on that occasion. Gatiss had asked the society's chairman for an invitation for the 2006 dinner. So there he was, in his tuxedo and black bow tie, about to make a speech in front of the assembled members, Holmesians as they called themselves, or Sherlockians for those who preferred the more widespread American term. They were seated in a dining room in the House of Commons, a magnificent and thoroughly fitting venue for a Victorian flight of fancy, with its carved oak panels and beautiful evening views across the Thames to the lights of Lambeth on the opposite bank. Slightly to the left was the London Eye, the symbol of modern London, and thus an updated version of Sherlock Holmes too. It was an anxious moment. That evening, Gatiss and Moffat would float their idea before a broad audience for the first time, and these particular guinea pigs were among the most critical, circumspect subjects you could imagine. Mark Gatiss was coming to the end of his speech. He had told the members of his long-standing interest in Holmes and had arrived at the train conversation with Moffat. We began to discuss the question, could Holmes be brought alive for a whole new generation? Gatiss said. He described the scenario. A young army doctor, wounded in Afghanistan, finds himself alone and friendless in London. That detail about Afghanistan had been crucial for Gatiss and Moffat. The tale of Sherlock Holmes could in fact be introduced in the same way, regardless of whether it was set around 1880 or in the present. Those regions that were ravaged by war in the late 19th century remain conflict zones to this day. Short of cash, Gatiss went on, he bumps into an old medical acquaintance, who tells him he knows of someone looking for a flatmate. This bloke's all right, but a little odd. And so Dr. John Watson, wounded in the taking of Kabul from the Taliban, meets Sherlock Holmes, a geeky, nervous young man, rather too fond of drugs, who's amassed a lot of out-of-the-way knowledge on his laptop. Gatiss looked out over the assembled Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts. It's only a thought, a beginning. The Sherlockians were a hardened bunch. Many attempts at recasting Sherlock Holmes had been made through the years. Some had succeeded, others had not. Would Gatiss and Moffat's idea of bringing Holmes into the present find fertile ground? But to prove Holmes immortal, Gatiss continued, it's essential he's not preserved in Victorian aspic, but allowed to live again. The general opinion among those present seemed to be that this was, well, controversial. It was also, nonetheless, intelligent, funny, and stimulating, much like Gatiss himself. The mood in the dining room was cheerful. Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat no longer had to hold their breath. Stage 1 was complete. Every era had its own Sherlock Holmes. For over a century, the famous detective had been reimagined to fit contemporary trends and ideals. Perhaps Gatiss and Moffat, with their new approach, would be the ones to ensure that yet another generation discovered Sherlock Holmes. Ladies and gentlemen, Gatiss concluded, I give you Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes, and Dr. Watson forever. Part 1, 1878 to 1887. Chapter 2. It was a Friday in late autumn 1878. Edinburgh's Royal Infirmary had moved to new premises at Lauriston Place, surroundings that benefited from significantly cleaner air than the old location toward the centre of town. Although the slum clearances around High Street and the steep alleys of the old town had been underway for almost a century, mortality was still much higher there than in the more prosperous Newtown neighbourhood. With its new Royal Infirmary, Edinburgh was now home to the largest and best-planned hospital in Britain, containing as many as 600 beds. It was also a place where a new generation of doctors undertook studies in modern, clinically based medicine. A man hurried down one of the hospital's corridors, waving a towel enthusiastically. This was a familiar sight to his colleagues and to his students, who always arrived on time for his lectures. He held his head high. His steel grey hair stood on end. His gait was jerky and energetic. His arms were like two great pendulums. He went through a small anteroom laboratory and then straight into Ward 11, his operating theatre. The terraces of wooden benches that surrounded the amphitheatre were packed. The Friday lectures delivered by this thin, gangly man were among the most popular on offer. The flickering gas lamps cast a bluish light. Down where the light was strongest, the man sat on a chair and unfurled the towel across his lap. He then got under way. "This, gentlemen, contains a most potent drug." He instructed his assistant to pass around a vial filled with an amber-coloured liquid. "It is extremely bitter to the taste. Now, I wish to see how many of you have developed the powers of observation that God granted you. But, sir, you will say, it can be analysed chemically. Aye, but I want you to taste it, by smell and taste. What? You shrink back? As I don't ask anything of my students which I wouldn't do alone with myself, I will taste it before passing it around." His voice was high and discordant, and his Lowland Scots was evident in every word. He dipped his finger into the liquid and looked up at the students. The young men on the benches watched as he popped his finger into his mouth, sucked, and grimaced. "No, you do likewise." Student after student tasted the liquid, displaying all manner of facial contortions before passing the bottle along. When it had made its way up to the top row, to its last tormented taster, a hearty laugh came from the floor. Gentlemen, he chortled, "I am deeply grieved to find that not one of you has developed his power of perception, the faculty of observation which I speak so much of. For if you truly had observed me, you would have seen that, while I placed my index finger in the awful brew, it was the middle finger, which somehow found its way into my mouth." The man with the towel was Dr. Joseph Bell, 41-year-old instructor of clinical surgery. His unorthodox methods were well known at the university. This was not the first cohort to have fallen for his vile trick. designed to give the young men their first great insight into the importance of observation. Bell wanted to demonstrate that the treatment of illness and injury was largely dependent on thorough, quick understanding of the small details that separated the patient's conditions from one of good health. To wake the students' interest in this approach, Joseph Bell demonstrated the extent to which a person who has trained his powers of observation can discover relevant, mundane details that will in turn reveal such information as the patient's history, nationality, and occupation. "Well, my man, you've served in the army," Bell said to the first patient of the day, a man in civilian clothes who had just entered the theatre after waiting in an adjoining room. Bell's assistants were extremely well organized, and no time was lost as the patients were brought in, one after the other, given their diagnoses, and then led away. "Aye, sir. Not long discharged?" "No, sir." "A Highland regiment?" "Aye, sir." "A non-commissioned officer?" "Aye, sir." "Stationed at Barbados?" "Aye, sir." "You see, gentlemen," he explained to his students, "the man was a respectful man, but did not remove his hat. They do not in the army, but he would have learned civilian ways had he been long discharged. He has an air of authority, and he is obviously Scottish. As to Barbados, his complaint is elephantiasis, which is West Indian and not British." The students took notes by the light of the gas lanterns. Bell's assertions, which had at first seemed miraculous, appeared perfectly logical after his explanation. During another lecture, an elderly woman was led into the theatre. She wore dark clothes and carried a worn black handbag. Bell glanced at her and said, "Where is your cutty pipe?" The woman drew her bag closer. "Don't mind the students," Bell said to the embarrassed old lady. "Show me the pipe." Sure enough, the old woman pulled out a clay cutty pipe. "No," Bell said, turning to the students. "How did I know she had the cutty pipe?" No answer. "Did you notice the ulcer on her lower lip and the glossy scar on her left cheek, indicating a superficial burn? All marks of a short-stemmed clay pipe held close to the cheek while smoking." Bell often tried to involve the students in the diagnoses, but their powers of observation were not sufficiently well honed. A young mustachioed man in the third row was among those whom Bell paid particular attention. The young man, named Arthur Conan Doyle, seemed to be noting down every word Bell said. Another patient entered Ward 11. "What is the matter with this man, eh?" Bell asked. He focused his stare on one of the students. "No, you mustn't touch him. Use your eyes, sir. Use your ears. Use your brain, your bump of perception, and use your purse of deduction." "Hip joint disease, sir?" spluttered the student. Bell leaned back in his chair and placed his fingertips together underneath his chin. "Hip nothing. The man's limp is not from his hip, but from his foot. Were you to observe closely, you would see there are slits cut by a knife in those parts of the shoes where the pressure of the shoe is greatest against the foot. The man is a sufferer from corns, gentlemen, and has no hip trouble at all. But he has not come here to be treated for corns, gentlemen. His trouble is of a much more serious nature. This is a case of chronic alcoholism, gentlemen. The rubicund nose, the puffed, bloated face, the bloodshot eyes, the tremulous hands and twitching face muscles, with the quick, pulsating temporal arteries, all show this. These deductions, gentlemen, must, however, be confirmed by absolute and concrete evidence. In this instance, my diagnosis is confirmed by the fact of my seeing the neck of a whiskey bottle protruding from the patient's right-hand coat pocket. Never neglect to ratify your deductions." The lecture was over. In the third row, Arthur Conan Doyle collected his notes and rose to his feet. He was tall and athletic, barely 20 years old. He made his way down from the audience and walked toward the exit. Chapter 3. Arthur Conan Doyle grasped the pen and began writing a letter to his mother. "Just a line to say that I move into my house tomorrow, number 1, Bush Villas, Elm Grove. I am wedged in between a church and a hotel, so I act as sort of a buffer. I have, though I say it, managed the whole business exceedingly well. There is nothing I put my mind to that I have not done most completely. I have a few shillings left to live on, and I put £5 by for the rent. My furniture is A1. Let me know when Connie comes. Any old carpeting or oil cloth most acceptable. It was June 1882. Arthur Conan Doyle had turned 23 a few weeks earlier, and had just moved to Southsea, a contiguous suburb of Portsmouth on the Channel coast of England. He wrote to his mother, Mary Doyle, about everything, and he did so often, sometimes almost daily. He described small, everyday things, all kinds of difficulties, and his innermost thoughts. His relationship with Elmo Weldon, who was still living with her parents in Ireland, had been patched up once more, in spite of the fact that the great distance meant that they almost never saw each other. Mary was kept comprehensively informed of the situation. If all went well in Portsmouth, he would marry Elmo. Until then, he would have to make do with exchanging letters. It wasn't long before a brass plaque was mounted outside his door, and Conan Doyle eagerly awaited the first patients at a medical practice all his own. His suggestion that his 14-year-old sister Connie should move down to Southsea to keep him company was not well received, but he continued to send wheedling letters, and eventually his 9-year-old brother, Innes, or Duff as he was known, moved in to act as a kind of servant boy. Conan Doyle was of the opinion that a doctor's prestige was undermined if he had to open the door to visiting patients himself, and, as he pointed out in a letter to his mother, the air was much healthier in Portsmouth. This is a far healthier term than Edinburgh. Our death rate is only 13. This compared favourably with Edinburgh's rate of a little over 20 deaths per 1,000 annually. The house was simply furnished, but its layout practical. A hall led to a reception room with a desk and 2 chairs, and then a waiting room with a bench and a further few chairs. One flight of stairs led up to the room where patients were treated. His own living room was immediately adjacent to that, and he had furnished 2 bedrooms up on the top floor. The curtains came from Aunt Annette. His mother had sent a large chest filled with books, ornaments for the mantelpiece in the reception room, and blankets for the bedrooms. He was grateful for the opportunity to display the objects he had collected after his studies, during the time he spent as a ship's doctor on a whaling vessel in the Arctic. As for his studies, it was during his 3rd year at the University of Edinburgh that he had begun attending lectures by Dr. Joseph Bell. He had, it would seem, somehow made an impression during those lectures, because Bell had offered him a role as his outpatient clerk. Conan Doyle had been assigned the task of receiving the patients in a room adjoining the operating theatre, noting their complaints and preparing them so that the consultation in Ward 11 could be conducted as quickly as possible. Sometimes he would take care of as many as 80 patients before a lecture. He showed them in, one by one, and Bell would always manage to ascertain more information with a single glance at the patient than Conan Doyle had managed to garner through his questioning. As Bell's assistant, Conan Doyle became even more inquisitive as to the methods of his lecturer. He would often ask about various details after the lecture and check that his notes were accurate. But how could you tell that the patient had arrived in town from the south and that he had walked across the links? On the showery day such as it had been, Bell answered, as Conan Doyle made notes in his little book, the reddish clay at the bare parts of the links adheres to the boot, and a tiny part is burnt to remain. There is no such clay anywhere else around the town for miles. In Southsea, Conan Doyle sat and waited. So far, no patients had rung the doorbell, but in less than half an hour on the Wednesday evening, no fewer than 28 people had stopped to read the brass plaque, and the following day the results were even better, 24 people in just 15 minutes. On Mondays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, the poor were offered free consultations between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. Conan Doyle had arranged to have this written on the plaque. A batch of medicines had arrived from London, at a cost exceeding £11. Nevertheless, this was still cheaper than sourcing them via local chemists, and all craftsmen need the tools of their trade. He had ended up in Portsmouth and Southsea purely by chance. He had made a failed attempt at running a practice with a colleague in Plymouth the previous spring. He had then moved on to Tavistock in Devon to see whether there were any openings for a young doctor. There were not. So he took the steamer to Portsmouth, where he found himself now, eager to start practicing the profession he had trained in, and with a serious need to earn some money. Innes boiled the last 6 potatoes over the open fire. They had some candles, but no gas. The small income Conan Doyle did have was mainly thanks to the stories he wrote for various periodicals. As usual, he told his mother all about them. "I have a wonderful story on hand, The Winning Shot, about mesmerism and murder and chemical magnetism, and a man's eating his own ears because he was hungry." Conan Doyle had written his first story at the age of 6, on paper folded in the folio format. Each line had space for 4 words, and the author had also provided illustrations in the margins. The plot centered on the meeting of a young man and a tiger. Conan Doyle described the man's untimely death with a great deal of realism. However, once the tiger had consumed all the man's body parts, one problem remained. What was the rest of the story going to be about? It would be 4 years before he created another work. In the intervening years, he had developed his talents through reading. He was allowed to borrow 1 book at a time from the library. Rumour had it that the library committee had called an extra meeting on the subject of young Arthur, at which it was decided that no member be allowed to change his or her loan more than 3 times per day. The books took him to the prairies where herds of buffalo roamed, to the great waves of the Pacific Ocean, and to chivalrous knights and comely maidens. Arthur's classmates at Stonyhurst College boarding school discovered just what a storyteller he was. On rainy days outside term time, he could be found on a bench, an audience of small boys sitting on the floor in front of him, as he regaled them with the tales of his heroes' fates and adventures. Week in, week out, his heroes went on fighting, struggling, and grunting, to his classmates' great amusement. They would bribe him with biscuits, willing him to continue, although sometimes he would stop just as the excitement peaked. He would later recall that after delivering a line such as, "With his left hand in a glossy locks, he was waving the blood-stained knife above her head when," he knew he had his audience in the palm of his hand. This was how his second book was created, not written, but told. In Southsea, the adult Conan Doyle was still waiting. In between the visits of a handful of patients, however, he was able to dedicate himself to writing. He got a lot done. 3 years earlier, at the age of 20, Conan Doyle had had his first short story published. An Edinburgh magazine had paid £3 for a story that was not far removed from his childhood tales of adventure. Another magazine had since published several of his short stories, and it was the payment for them that had enabled him to purchase that parcel of expensive medicines from London. Conan Doyle continued to write, preferring supernatural phenomena as subject matter, and sent off cylinders containing the rolled-up manuscripts. First he turned to the most popular periodicals, the Cornhill Magazine, Temple Bar, and many others. The cylinders came back only to be sent on immediately to other publications. It was an endless cycle of constant rejection and new attempts. After a long struggle, he began to succeed, and more of his stories appeared in print. This success did not result in any praise whatsoever, though, since the magazines had a policy of not publishing the names of their authors. When one of his short stories was published in London's most influential literary monthly, the Cornhill Magazine, one critic was convinced that it had to be the work of Robert Louis Stevenson. It was written in the same adventurous style, and was at least as good as Stevenson's submissions. In fact, the reviewer went as far as to compare the tale to the work of the master of the short story, Edgar Allan Poe. It was incredibly flattering, yes, but for an anonymous author, terribly frustrating. Chapter 4. If there was one thing Conan Doyle loved besides writing, it was sports. He had been fascinated by athletics from a very young age, and Portsmouth gave him many opportunities to engage his interest. It was January 9th, 1886, and England was experiencing the harshest winter in living memory. Temperatures were below freezing, and those who could do so stayed indoors. The nation was at a standstill. Electric trams could not cope with the ice and slush. Passengers longed for a return to their trusty horse-drawn predecessors. Out in the country, where roads were impassable, many sheep were feared to have perished in the colossal snowdrifts. In Portsmouth North End, however, men played football. Portsmouth Association Football Club was still in its infancy, but had already seen success. One of the fullbacks in particular, A.C. Smith, drew the plaudits, and his powerful punting was praised in the press. Once a goalkeeper, Smith had later progressed to right back. Deep down, he was a rugby player, but he had quickly adapted to kicking rather than carrying the ball. At 6'1" and 225 pounds, he was a cornerstone of the team and an increasingly popular Portsmouth athlete. It had become clear to Conan Doyle that he wasn't going to get any patients by simply putting up a brass plaque and then sitting back and waiting. An unwritten rule decreed that doctors did not advertise their services. Conan Doyle, though, found a loophole. In one of the local newspapers, under the heading Miscellaneous Wants, he submitted a short notice. Dr. Doyle begs to notify that he has removed to 1 Bush Villas, Elm Grove, next to the Bush Hotel. He would change his name to suit the occasion. Sometimes he would shorten it, becoming simply Doyle. Otherwise he used Conan Doyle as his surname. Doyle was his father's family name, and Conan came from his godfather, Michael Conan, his grandfather's brother-in-law. In the case of the Miscellaneous Wants notice, newspapers usually charged by the word, and choosing a shorter name was a question of being economical. He published the notice several times to make sure that the citizens now knew of his existence. There were also other ways in which to raise the profile of the practice. One November day, an accident occurred in the street outside. A man fell from his horse after one of his stirrups broke, and the horse then fell on top of him. Conan Doyle rushed out to attend to the injured party. After taking him inside and declaring that the man had suffered nothing more serious than some nasty bruising, Conan Doyle did what any doctor in his position would do. He hurried over to the Portsmouth Evening News to recount the day's events. The story of the doctor's intervention appeared in the evening edition that same day. To simply sit and wait for further good fortune of the sort would be rather too optimistic. No, the 23-year-old newly qualified doctor would have to go out and meet and get to know the people of Portsmouth. He began to exchange services with tradesmen in the town. A grocer came to see him, seeking treatment for his incipient epilepsy. Conan Doyle received butter and tea in return. The poor grocer never suspected the doctor's delight upon hearing of further seizures a short while later, more butter and tea. It was not merely potential patients that he needed to become acquainted with. It was customary in the medical profession for newly qualified doctors to pay visits to older colleagues in the neighborhood. Despite his young age and inexperience, Conan Doyle had no difficulty making an impression on his fellow physicians. One sent patients onto him, while another was a member of the cricket club, which Conan Doyle also joined. He played for the Portsmouth Cricket Club as a batsman, and his on-field exploits were often reported in the local newspapers. Cricket was the kind of sport that doctors were expected to participate in, while the same could not be said for association football or soccer. While his teammates, and indeed the press, surely knew who he was, an alias to protect his good name as a doctor could do no harm. So when he took to the football pitch to belt the leather sphere in all weathers, he was no longer Conan Doyle, but the rather more anonymous A.C. Smith. Conan Doyle's social sphere continued to expand. He was elected a member of the Portsmouth Literary and Scientific Society, which arranged lectures every other Tuesday evening during the winter months. Many of Portsmouth's most influential people were members, and for Conan Doyle it represented another rung on the ladder of social advancement. Membership in the society was restricted to men. Women were welcome to attend the lecture evenings as guests, but were not permitted to ask questions or participate in discussions. The editor of one of the city's newspapers wondered whether something could be done about the women's incessant engagement in handicraft during meetings. It was, he felt, annoying.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?